Good afternoon, everybody. This is Ann Lund, and I'm coming to you from my podcast, Haunted and Waiting. As always, I want to thank Gary from the Eye Opener Society for allowing me this platform to share my stories and my passion for anything haunted or paranormal, specifically ghosts. Today's subject is easily titled, Why Children See Ghosts and Adults Don't. So, I feel that we have been conditioned to ignore the obvious, and that is why we generally don't see ghosts, or I shouldn't say that. I should say pay attention to them because I do believe they are around all the time. They give us messages all the time. However, we've been conditioned to ignore them. Children, however, often report seeing ghosts and spirits and unexplained figures, things that adults usually will dismiss as imagination. But what if children are actually perceiving a little bit more? And it's the adults who have trained themselves to tune it out. So, in this podcast, I'm going to share some of my own experiences, explore some famous childhood paranormal experiences of some famous people, and maybe even examine some of the science behind the possibility as to why children might see more or experience more than we do. So, if you have a child or you're around children, you're going to notice that some things do stand out when they're little. For instance, children tend to talk to themselves. They do this when they're playing. A lot of times they will come and they will say they have an imaginary friend. I know with my children, one of the two, this was the case. I would walk into the room and there was a full-fledged conversation, nobody there. And when I would ask him, who are you talking to? He would look at me as if to say, well, that person right there, and then go on. At that time, he was very young, so his language skills weren't developed. I would say maybe about 18 months. So I couldn't delve more into it than what I just said, a key point. It was very obvious that he saw something that I didn't see. Other things that might key you into your children seeing things, if they refuse to walk into a room or visit a specific house, open a closet, things like that. It could be that there was a situation when they saw something maybe that startled them, and now they don't want to go back into that same situation. Or sometimes a child might come over to you and say, well, that pencil moved, or the door opened, or the pillow fell off. Things like that. A lot of times we will just dismiss them, but I don't know if we should. Sometimes I feel spirits feel like they can communicate more with children because they're not going to be judged as harshly. So let's move on. Namely, I want to talk about something called a poltergeist or a noisy ghost, as it translates into German. And poltergeists typically happen to children. It can happen to an adult, of course, but more often than not, it does happen to children. Just in the movie that was with that same title, The Poltergeist, where young Carol Ann is able to speak to spirits through her television, things like that are not as uncommon as we may think. Surely it may not be as spectacular as in the movie, but little things like that are not that uncommon. With my own childhood encounter, if you've listened to my blog my podcast or read my blog, which is called Haunted and Waiting .blog, if you're interested, just hop on over if you'd rather read these things than listen to them. I talk about the house that I grew up in, New York City, which I was wholly convinced was a haunted house. Wholly convinced. It was only myself and one other person that lived in the house that saw things, experienced things, where everybody else seemed to be oblivious to it. Childhood friends would come in and see things, though. Again, all children. But when I was young, I did see a full-bodied apparition. Again, I was about 11, I would say. And I tried telling people about it, and I was chastised and kind of should have been conditioned maybe to stop talking about these things, but I wasn't because it was so clear to me. But in that house, we've had other children, and I can tell you one of my nieces routinely used to talk to somebody who, when she was about 18 months to 2 years, who she referred to as Pogie. when she tried to describe this person that she saw, oftentimes when she was in her crib, she described it as a man. She said he was wearing a hat. She said he wore black clothes. But other than that, she couldn't say anything else. He didn't seem to scare her, but she did see him a lot and she did speak about him a lot. And the family members in our family tend to think it was cute, it was made up. I, on the other hand, did not see it that way. My own son, when he would come to that house years, decades later, he had a habit of, again, he was about 18 months, 2 years old, poking in the corner of my mother's kitchen, and he would say that he saw a man there. And he'd say it all the time, like this, there was a man as if it was floating in the room. Again, we thought it was cute. Well, I didn't. I wholly believed him, but people in the family thought it was cute. They joked about it. Oh, do you see him again? And he'd nod his head, and sometimes he'd babble. He was a late talker, but he'd put his fingers in his mouth, and you could tell he was tracking something that nobody else seemed to see. So, and if you've listened to my other podcast on crisis apparitions or read my blog on crisis apparitions, I mentioned another story where a dear friend of mine had her niece over, and the moment the niece's grandfather had died, this was a grandfather on the other side of the family, not related to my friend. She didn't know that the grandfather had passed, and she raised her hands up in the air and basically to be lifted, and she said, "Grandpa." And obviously he was not there, and my friend didn't know it at the time, but he had passed away. So clearly, it's a little bit too coincidental that this man had died and the granddaughter had spoken to him and clearly had seen him. Again, she said she was around that 18-month to, I want to say maybe 2-year age level. I did not know this child. But let's go into some famous cases with children seeing ghosts. And there is documentation. Some of the earliest that I was able to find was from 1716, documented a family called the Wesley family in Epworth, England. It was a Methodist family, very religious family, where the children from the years of 1716 and 1717 saw many apparitions in this house. One who they called Old Jeffrey, and they would have conversations with this spirit that the adults could not see. Now, there were people that worked in the house. I guess they were maybe nannies, or it was a rich family that would report these stories, and it spread through the town. And sadly, the father of these children was so upset about this and thought this was just utter nonsense that he adamantly refused to have any of the servants perpetuating these stories of these apparitions that the children were claiming that they saw. And it's documented that they heard footsteps, chains, horns being blown, and oddly enough, wood being sawn as if somebody was sawing wood. But all the children were hearing this and reporting it. And then when the father, a reverend, a religious man, found out that the stories were perpetuated, he basically put his foot down and he said, "No more." Very sad, because this sounded like a very active home, and we could have got some more information than just the 1 year span time where they were reporting these things. If we skip over to America, there was this case in 1877 called the Watseka Wonder, where a young girl, I want to say her name was Laurency. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly. She was living in Illinois at the time. She was 14, and you do hear this sometimes. This spike. There's a lot of it happening with young children, preschoolers, so before the age of 3, where language is fully developed, which is sad because they can't really express what they're seeing. But then there's this other spike that happens during puberty. That's when it happened to me. I was around 11. And so this other spike, and this girl, Laurency, she was 14 years old and apparently had a ton of experiences in her house where she was claiming to hear all these ghostly voices. She was probably what we would call a clairaudient, so someone who senses voices as opposed to seeing things visually. But at night, she was hearing a lot of voices, and a lot of the information that she was telling family members later claimed to be true. So there were things, names of people that had passed, that had mentioned places that she could not have possibly known. So apparently, in this family, the people surrounding this girl went the extra step to see if these people that she was talking to or these places that they were mentioning were actually true. And apparently they were. And they couldn't explain how she could have known all of this. Um, Move more into the 19th century. We're going to talk now, 1977, right? So this was about the time that I was experiencing my hauntings. But this happened in London, and this was called the Enfield poltergeist. You can look all of these up, by the way. I will link web pages to my blog. So if you hop on over to my blog, which is Haunted and Waiting, again, Haunted and Waiting blog. I will link all these stories there so you can research some more. But the Enfield poltergeist happened in 1977 to an 11-year-old. Again, we're talking that puberty, just entering puberty. Um, a young girl named Janet Hodgson and actually her sister were experiencing very strange things. So levitating furniture, disembodied voices, again, probably a clairaudient. Disembodied means you're hearing a voice, but there's no body attached to it. And eerie knocking throughout the whole house. Now, this, again, is what we would call a poltergeist. It's a noisy ghost, one that wants to be heard. But interestingly enough, this drew the attention from the police department because they were called several times to investigate the house, and apparently they had seen some stuff. And journalists also wrote about this. So, real classic hallmark of a childhood ghost sightings. So, I'll link those web pages on my blog. Let's talk about celebrities, because this doesn't just happen to just your common friends and what have you, but Kate Hudson famously said, "I see dead people all the time." Kind of like in The Sixth Sense, where he says, "I see dead people, they don't know they're dead." Well, Kate Hudson said the same thing. She said, "I see dead people all the time." And she claims that from a young age, she had many childhood ghost encounters, including one that kept repeating itself. And she referred to it as a faceless woman. Um, that's pretty horrifying. My experience with the paranormal or ghosts have always been good. They've never been really scary. I can't imagine seeing a faceless woman, but Kate Hudson claims she had. She credited this all to her grandmother, apparently, who had a gift. You'll see this sometimes. People that are able, or children that are able to see this, you have some family. It usually skips a generation, so it most likely would be a grandparent or an aunt on that level, that family line. A Keanu Reeves, who doesn't love Keanu Reeves, sensitive soul, if I could say the least. But he claimed while he was living in New York City, he used to see as a child a ghostly figure in a white suit. He said it would drift in and out of his bedroom. He had very vivid memories about this, and he speaks about it as well. Keanu Reeves, very sensitive person. If you know anything about him, and it would make sense that he'd be sensitive to these sorts of things as well. And believe it or not, Ariana Grande claims that when she was in Kansas City, she smelled sulfur and she heard whispering voices and she saw shadow figures. And this was, again, when she was a child. Now, Ariana Grande was famous, started her career as a child. So I'm imagining this happened at that time. But she is an enthusiast, and you can link or look at the links on my blog on her as well. So, why do children see ghosts more? Or is it just that they have no filter like we have? Well, I personally think it has something to do with their brain development. So I'm going to give you a little bit of science here. Children's brains, they're just developing. So they don't have the same brain structure that we have. And so the prefrontal cortex, it controls logical thinking, all right? So as adults, we see something, we always go for a logical explanation because that part of our brain, which is in the front of our heads, is well developed. In children, this is not the case. It is not well developed. It is developing. And so they rely more on instinct, which is like the older brain, which is kind of in the back. They react a lot on instinct. I mean, as infants, they still have some reflexes that we don't have anymore. And so I feel that this lack of this logical thinking, as I'm going to say in quotes, because I don't think it's too um, logical to dismiss something as being paranormal, but they lack that. So I think they automatically don't try to understand it and just accept it, right? Um, the other thing is, I've spoken to Gary about this a lot. I am an avid meditator. And the type of meditative practice that I engage in requires me to meditate twice a day. And I've been doing this for years. And we know that when you meditate, your brain waves slow down. It calms your whole nervous system down. Um, so beta brain waves are very much associated with focus, attention, and again, logical thinking. Okay. Um, Children, on the other hand, don't their brain waves are a little bit slower. So they function a lot of times on alpha and theta, which is more like a slower pace. And when you meditate, you go into that alpha theta states. Those states are commonly associated with creativity, um, altered states of consciousness, which we have to meditate to get to that area. For those of you that meditate, it's an amazing feeling. If you pray, it's an amazing feeling. Children can access this a lot easier than we can. That's why they're so creative. So you might have noticed in yourself when you were younger, you were able to draw better, or you were able to imagine things better. You could write better. Your creativity was so much better than it. And as you get older, it gets less and less. Myself as a writer, I can tell you, I was a lot more creative of a writer when I was in my teens than I am now. So it could be that with children, this slower brainwave function allows them to access altered states that we cannot. So that's a theory that I have. Um, and then they have not also, the other thing I want to mention is they have not learned to be skeptics. So they haven't been taught yet to dismiss this, like, you're crazy, that's not there. What typically happens with a young child is we'll say something, oh, that's so cute, and we let it go. As they get older, we say to them, you shouldn't talk like that. You know you're making that up. That's insane. There's nothing under your bed. There's no one in your closet. And by continuously telling our children this, I think we are basically conditioning them to be skeptics. So that's that. The other thing that I can think of is there's also less distractions. So they are not as distracted as we are, like with social media and people around us. Excuse, that's my dog. Got an itch, but they can be a little bit more focused on this kind of stuff. So they accept it. There's somebody in the room talking to them. They accept it. And we, on the other hand, what are we going to do? Most likely, we're going to rub our eyes, dismiss it, walk out of the room, or say something, make something up. It could, I mean, I must have imagined it. A child isn't going to say that. They're not going to say, I must have imagined it. To them, it's right there. Now, why do adults lose the ability? Well, as we get older, I think I've mentioned society and cultural conditioning teaches us to separate fact from fantasy, although I don't think it's fantasy. And adults, we're rewarded for being logical. Okay. And we're punished for accepting the paranormal. So I've gone through this my entire life. There's a ton of people like myself in my group that talk about this all the time. You are punished for talking this way, and you cannot. So that's that. Well, my final thoughts on this, basically, maybe we should just relearn to see things. Maybe children are seeing ghosts, and it's not a matter of imagination after all, but a matter of openness And that as adults, we've tuned out from a whole reality that exists around us, but we won't allow it. So I've said this before. I don't think I am necessarily psychic. I just think I don't give up or I look into things a little bit more than other people. I think we all kind of have a sixth sense. Some people are just a little better at accessing it. So, in closing, I think by letting go of fear and disbelief, we may slowly rediscover what we had once, this ability to enter this world with like childlike wonder and curiosity and see what actually is really there. So, in closing, I want to thank everybody for listening thus far. If you are on Facebook, you can find me on Haunted and Waiting on Facebook. It's a group. It's a small group. I like to keep it small. Friendly group. Share your stories there. If you're on TikTok, I've just joined TikTok. It is Haunted and Waiting at Ann Lund 333. You can find me there. Of course, you can find me on the Eye Opener Society on Podbeam, YouTube, Spotify. He's basically on all of the venues. And of course, you can also find me on my blog, hauntedandwaiting.blog. And I would love you to pay a visit, comment. It just pushes the algorithm out so they can bring you more. On that blog, I do have a free novel called My Bronx Haunting, where I talk about my stories growing up in a city in New York, in a house in New York City that was haunted in the 80s. So with that, I say goodbye to everybody. And just remember, you may be seeing things, you may be experiencing things. Don't dismiss it because you too may be haunted and waiting. Till next time, my dear friends, this is Ann Lund.